Story 1. The Ambush in the Sahara. This story is one I came across in a personal diary from a British soldier stationed in North Africa during World War II. The events took place in 1942 during one of the many battles between British and German forces in the desert. The man who wrote it claimed he never talked about it again after the war. In the middle of 1942, we were deep in the Sahara Desert, part of a British supply convoy trying to keep the tanks and infantry going. The desert was hell on earth. The heat was unbearable, sand got into everything, and the sun turned the sky white during the day, blinding you even through your goggles. But the worst part was the isolation, the feeling that you were marching through a wasteland that could swallow you whole. Our convoy was 10 trucks long, filled with fuel, ammunition, and water, vital supplies for our boys pushing against Rommel's Afrika Korps. We'd been ordered to take a route through the desert to avoid detection by the Germans. It was a risk, but with the constant bombings, this was the only way to get the supplies through. I was in the middle truck, riding with our commander, Lieutenant Harkness. There were 15 of us in total. No one spoke much, just the steady drone of engines, the wheels kicking up plumes of sand behind us. For hours, it was nothing but endless dunes stretching to the horizon. No sign of life anywhere, just the barren, silent desert. By late afternoon, the temperature started to drop as the sun sank lower. We planned to stop and make camp before nightfall. That's when things started to go wrong. One of the lead trucks slowed to a stop. The engine sputtered, then cut out completely. Lieutenant Harkness ordered everyone to pull over and set up a perimeter. As the men went to check the truck, I stood by, scanning the horizon with binoculars. I wasn't expecting to see much, just more sand. But then, in the distance, maybe a mile or two away, I saw something strange. It looked like figures, people standing on top of a ridge. At first, I thought it was a mirage, the heat playing tricks on my eyes. But as I focused, I could see them more clearly. 4 or 5 figures just standing there watching us. They weren't moving, weren't coming toward us, just standing on the ridge like statues. I called over Lieutenant Harkness. He took the binoculars from me, squinting toward the ridge. Locals? I asked. We had come across Bedouin tribesmen before, but they usually stayed far from the fighting. Harkness lowered the binoculars, his face tense. No, too far from any village. And they're too still. He didn't like it, and neither did I. Everyone, get ready to move, Harkness barked. We're not stopping here. But before we could get the convoy moving again, a sharp crack echoed across the desert. At first, I thought it was the truck's engine backfiring. Then I heard it again, another crack, then another. Bullets. We were under fire. Ambush, someone shouted, and chaos broke loose. We hit the sand, diving behind the trucks for cover. I could hear the shots whizzing past us, kicking up puffs of sand. The firing was coming from that ridge. Those figures hadn't been locals. They were German snipers. Return fire, Harkness ordered. The men scrambled for their rifles, aiming toward the ridge, but it was hard to see. The sun was setting behind the snipers, turning them into silhouettes. They had the advantage. We were sitting ducks in the open desert, no cover except for our trucks. I fired off a few rounds, but I wasn't sure if I hit anything. The snipers were too well hidden, too far away. Then came the explosion. One of our trucks, the second one in the convoy, went up in flames, the fuel tanks igniting in a massive fireball. The shockwave knocked me off my feet, my ears ringing. I scrambled to my feet, coughing as the smoke and sand filled the air. Men were screaming, trying to get away from the burning truck. Harkness, I shouted, trying to find him through the chaos. I saw him, crouched behind a truck, yelling into his radio. We're pinned down. Need air support. Do you copy? But the radio was dead, just static. We were alone out there, completely cut off. Another shot rang out, and I saw one of our men, Private Dawson, drop to the sand, clutching his chest. He didn't get back up. Jesus Christ, Anderton, the driver next to me, muttered, his face pale as he fired blindly into the ridge. They're picking us off, one of the others yelled. We have to move. But moving meant running out into the open, and the Germans would cut us down in seconds. Harkness crawled over to me, his face smeared with sand and sweat. We can't stay here. They'll take out the rest of the convoy if we don't move. I nodded, my heart pounding. What do we do? There's a gully about half a mile north, Harkness said. We make a break for it. One truck, maximum speed. The rest provide cover. It was suicide, but staying put was worse. The men were already preparing. 2 would get in the remaining truck while the rest of us would lay down covering fire. We had to distract the Germans long enough to give the truck a chance to escape. On my mark, Harkness said. 3, 2, 1. Now! The truck roared to life, its wheels spinning in the sand as it tore forward toward the gully. We opened fire, spraying bullets toward the ridge, trying to keep the snipers pinned. I fired round after round until my rifle clicked empty. The truck was halfway there when another shot cracked the air, and the driver slumped over the wheel. The truck veered off course, smashing into a dune and flipping onto its side. No! I shouted, my throat raw. We were out of options. No way to escape. That's when I saw the Germans coming down the ridge. They weren't firing anymore. They didn't need to. They were coming to finish the job. We were down to 5 men, 2 of us wounded. The fire from the burning truck cast long shadows across the sand, and I could see the Germans clearly now, moving fast, rifles raised. Harkness grabbed my shoulder. Fall back to the wreck. We make our stand there. I nodded, my legs trembling as I dragged Anderton, who had taken a shot in the leg, back toward the wrecked truck. We huddled behind the metal, the heat from the fire searing our faces. The Germans were close now. Too close. Then Harkness did something I'll never forget. He stood up, fully exposed, and shouted at us, "Go. Run. I'll hold them." Before I could stop him, he opened fire, his rifle blazing. He knew he wouldn't last, but he gave us the chance to escape. And we took it. I ran, dragging Anderton with me, bullets flying past us, the Germans firing back. I didn't look back, not until I heard the final shot. When I did, Harkness was lying in the sand, his rifle silent. But his sacrifice wasn't in vain. We made it to the gully, and by some miracle, we found another British patrol hours later. They never found the rest of the convoy. The desert took them all, buried under the sand, lost to time. To this day, I don't know why I survived when so many didn't. But I'll never forget Lieutenant Harkness, or the look on his face when he gave his life so we could live. Story 2. The Frozen Village. This story is one I came across when researching survivor accounts from the Eastern Front of World War II, where brutal, bloody battles played out in the harshest conditions imaginable. One soldier, a Russian, told this to his grandson years after the war, and it stayed with me ever since. It was late January of 1943. We had been marching for days, deep into the Russian countryside, pushing the Germans back inch by inch. Our squad had been separated from the main platoon during a skirmish, and we were trying to find our way back. 7 men, trudging through waist-deep snow, the cold biting at our faces, making it hard to breathe. It was a brutal winter. Temperatures dropped to 30 below, and frostbite was starting to claim a few of the men. The snow made everything look the same, white, endless white. The trees were skeletons, thin and brittle. Every step felt like it could be our last. We had no food left, no maps, and no sign of where the front lines were. Late in the afternoon, we came across a village. It wasn't on our maps, but it didn't matter at that point. We needed shelter, and the sight of those small, wooden houses was like a miracle. The sun was starting to set, casting long, dark shadows over the snow, and the thought of spending another night in the open was too much to bear. As we got closer, something felt wrong. It wasn't immediately obvious, but as we walked into the village, I noticed that the place was silent. Not just quiet, the kind of silence that clings to your skin, that presses in on you. No birds, no wind, no movement at all. Just stillness. The houses looked abandoned, doors hanging off their hinges, windows broken. But there were no tracks in the snow, no signs of anyone leaving recently. The village wasn't bombed, No obvious destruction, but something had driven the people away. There were no bodies, though. Not a single one. We split up to check the houses. I remember stepping into one of the cottages. Inside, it was like the family had just vanished mid-meal. A pot of frozen stew sat on the stove, chairs knocked over, boots near the door. But the place was cold, colder than it should have been, like the walls were sucking the warmth out of you. My breath fogged the air, and I could see frost creeping up the inside of the windows. I wasn't alone for long. Kolya, one of the younger soldiers, barged in, eyes wide. "Sergey, there's something wrong with this place. We shouldn't stay here." I told him he was being paranoid, that we needed shelter. But in my gut, I knew he was right. We gathered in one of the larger houses, huddled around a stove, trying to get warm. The men were jumpy, jittery, whispering about what had happened to the villagers. Some said they'd fled from the Germans, but others thought something worse. Something had driven them out. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. There was a pressure in the air, like something was watching us, something just out of sight. Every creak of the old wooden floors, every gust of wind, made us grip our rifles a little tighter. Then we found the well. Just before dusk, one of the men, Jaeger, went looking for water. He came back pale as a sheet, his hands shaking. "The well," he stammered. "It's full of bodies." I didn't believe him at first. We thought he was hallucinating from the cold, but we all went to see for ourselves. Sure enough, just outside the last house in the village was a stone well, the bucket and rope still hanging. We lifted the lid, shining a flashlight down into the darkness. The beam cut through the shadows and landed on a tangled mess of bodies. Men, women, children, all frozen solid, packed together like sardines. Their faces were twisted, frozen in mid-scream, eyes wide open, staring up at us. It wasn't the Germans who'd done it, though. No bullets, no blood, no sign of struggle. It was like they just climbed in or been thrown in. We stumbled back in horror, trying to figure out what the hell had happened here. But no one had any answers. And that's when we heard the first scream. It was distant, echoing across the village. At first, we thought it was the wind, but then it came again, closer, high-pitched, raw terror. It didn't sound human. I'll never forget that sound. The men started shouting, scrambling for their rifles, but there was nothing to see. The scream was coming from nowhere, yet it surrounded us. I could feel it, pressing in on me, the weight of the cold, the darkness. Something was in that village with us, something we couldn't see, but it was there. I knew it, and the others knew it too. Kolya was the first to break. He dropped his rifle and started running. Just bolted into the woods, screaming that he wouldn't die there. We never saw him again. The rest of us, we ran too. Any direction, it didn't matter. We just needed to get away from that place, from those bodies in the well, from the thing that was out there, hunting us. By morning, only 3 of us made it out of the forest. We found our way back to the main platoon, but no one believed our story. They said the cold had gotten to us, made us see things that weren't there. But we knew what we saw. I still wake up some nights, hearing that scream, that sound, like the village itself was crying out, trying to warn us, or maybe trying to claim us. Story 3. The Trap in Budapest. This story comes from a forgotten chapter of World War II, during the siege of Budapest in early 1945. It's one of those harrowing tales shared by soldiers who survived the most extreme circumstances, moments of sheer terror and survival. I was 19, just a kid, part of the Soviet army that was fighting its way into Budapest in 1945. The city was in ruins, bombs, artillery fire, and street-by-street fighting had reduced it to rubble. The Germans were fighting like cornered animals, and we were ordered to clear out a neighborhood block near the Danube. They told us it was critical for the final push, but no one really knew what was happening. The fighting was so chaotic, communication was practically non-existent. There were 5 of us sent to recon a few buildings that had reportedly been abandoned by the Germans. Myself, Mikhail, Andrei, Pavel, and our sergeant, Dmitri. I remember the tension in the air, like the city was holding its breath. Every corner, every shattered window felt like an ambush waiting to happen. The streets were filled with debris, craters from mortar shells, burnt-out trucks, and bodies frozen in the snow. I tried not to look too closely at them, but it was impossible to ignore. Civilian, soldier, it didn't matter anymore. Budapest was a graveyard. We entered a half-collapsed apartment building, this one a bit more intact than the rest. A winding staircase led us up to the second floor. Dmitri ordered us to move carefully, one at a time, but even then, the place felt too quiet. Not the normal quiet of a battle zone. This was something different. Too still. We reached the top of the stairs, rifles ready, and entered a long corridor lined with doors. Most of them were blown off their hinges or hanging crooked. We spread out, checking each room. The building was empty. At least that's what we thought. I pushed open a door on the left and saw it. A German helmet on the floor, next to an overturned chair. My pulse quickened, my hand tightening on my rifle. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Mikhail stepped into the next room over, and then all hell broke loose. Bang! A rifle shot exploded from inside his room, and we heard Mikhail scream. A second later, another shot rang out, followed by a brutal, wet thud. We rushed into the room, and there was Mikhail, crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. A German soldier was standing in the corner, rifle in hand, wild-eyed. He had fired the first shot, but Mikhail had managed to stab him with his bayonet before collapsing. Both of them were dead. Shit, Andrei yelled. We dragged Mikhail's body back toward the hall, but before we could process what had happened, gunfire erupted from down the corridor, bursts of automatic fire, bouncing off the walls. Bullets started whizzing past us, tearing chunks out of the walls. They were waiting for us. Dmitri shouted. We're in a trap. We dove for cover, ducking into separate rooms. I could hear boots pounding on the stairs. They were coming from behind, too. We were surrounded. I peered out of the doorway, trying to see down the hall, when a grenade bounced across the floor, rolling straight toward us. Grenade! I screamed. Instinct kicked in. I grabbed it with shaking hands and flung it back down the hall. A second later, boom! The explosion shook the building, filling the corridor with dust and debris. But it had bought us a few seconds. Dmitri pulled me back into cover. They're trying to push us into the street, he said, gasping for breath. We can't let them. But it was chaos. The Germans were shooting from above, below, windows, doorways. Every shadow was a possible death sentence. Pavel was pinned down in the next room, shouting for help. Andrei and Dmitri laid down, suppressing fire while I crawled toward Pavel. Keep your head down, I yelled, dragging him behind a half-blown wall. His leg had been shredded by a burst of gunfire, blood soaking through his pant leg. I tried to stop the bleeding, but it was bad. Too bad. Pavel's face was pale, his breath shallow. Just get me out of here, he whispered. But there was nowhere to go. I could hear the Germans getting closer, their shouts in the stairwell. We needed to move fast. Dmitri was already thinking ahead. We can't stay here, he said. We need to make it to the rooftops. It's our only chance. The rooftops. It was insane, but it was the only plan we had. If we stayed in the building, we'd be dead within minutes. The Germans knew the terrain better than we did, and they had the numbers. But on the roofs, at least we'd have a chance to escape, maybe make it back to the others. I lifted Pavel, throwing his arm over my shoulder, and we started making our way toward the staircase that led up to the roof access. Bullets were still flying, ricocheting off the stone walls, but we pushed forward, the sound of our boots echoing as we climbed the stairs. When we burst onto the rooftop, the cold air hit me like a wall. Below us, the city was burning, smoke rising in thick plumes. I could see the Danube in the distance, frozen and jagged. The Germans were still inside the building, but it wouldn't be long before they realized where we'd gone. And then I saw it, 2 Germans on the roof next door, rifles raised. Get down, I shouted, pulling Pavel behind a chimney as gunfire erupted. Dmitri and Andrei fired back, but we were pinned again. There was no cover, nowhere to go. I could hear the footsteps behind us, more Germans coming up the stairs. We were trapped. There was no doubt about it now. Dmitri, breathing hard, looked at me. We jumped. I stared at him. "What?" "There," he said, nodding toward the next rooftop. It was at least a 10-foot gap, the kind of jump you only make if you've got no other choice. But we had no time to argue. The Germans behind us were getting closer, and the ones on the next roof were reloading. Andre was the first to jump. He cleared the gap, barely, rolling as he hit the next roof. Then Dmitri went. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I could do it with Pavel dragging me down, but there was no other way. "Hold on," I whispered to him. We ran for the edge, leaped into the air, and for a second, I felt weightless, the cold wind rushing past. We slammed into the next roof, my knees smashing against the stone, but we made it. We didn't stop. No one looked back. We just ran, sprinting across the rooftops, away from that death trap of a building. Story 4. The Forest in Belgium. This story is based on a true account I came across while reading about World War II, specifically stories shared by veterans and survivors. It was December 1944, right in the heart of the Ardennes, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was raging, and I was part of a small infantry unit, barely holding the line. The Germans had surprised us, pushing through our defenses, and we were trying to regroup, scattered across miles of thick, freezing woods. The cold was unforgiving. Ice clung to your face, your fingers stiffened, and your breath froze in front of you like a fog. I'll never forget the sound. Silence, eerie, thick silence. No gunfire, no shouting. Just the creak of trees bending under the weight of snow. My unit had been wiped out in an ambush 2 days before, and I was one of the few survivors, left wandering aimlessly through the forest. I was desperate, half-starved, and trying to find a safe place to regroup with any allies. On that second night alone, my mind was frayed, and the darkness in the woods felt wrong. I knew something wasn't right. I spotted a flicker of light through the trees, maybe half a mile away. My first instinct was hope. Maybe it was a campfire from other Allied soldiers. So, I crept closer, staying low, careful not to make a sound. As I approached, I saw them, a group of German soldiers. They were gathered around a fire, and my heart sank. There was no way I could take them on, not alone. I was weak and had only a few rounds left in my rifle. But I noticed something off. The Germans didn't look like they were relaxing or keeping watch. They were whispering, frantic, like they were on edge. Their eyes kept darting into the trees around them, and they seemed as scared as I was. I crouched down behind a snowbank, gripping my rifle, trying to stay calm, trying to listen to what they were saying. That's when I heard it, this low, rumbling sound in the distance. At first, I thought it might be artillery fire, but it didn't have the same explosive power. No, it sounded like heavy breathing, like something big was moving through the woods, slowly, methodically, toward the Germans. I could see the fear in their faces. They had heard it too. Suddenly, one of them stood up, shouting something in German I couldn't understand. The others grabbed their rifles and aimed into the trees. They weren't aiming at me. Whatever was out there, it was close. They were terrified, and then it happened. One of the soldiers fired his rifle. A few seconds later, another one. They were shooting into the darkness at nothing. I couldn't see anything, but the sound, the breathing, was getting louder. They were panicking, yelling and firing blindly, but no one was shooting at me. I kept low, frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I thought about running, but if I moved, they'd see me, or whatever was out there would hear me. So I stayed. And then, out of nowhere, the gunfire stopped. Silence again. I slowly lifted my head to peek over the snowbank. All 5 German soldiers were gone. The fire was still burning, but there wasn't a single body, no sign of a struggle. Just gone. No tracks leading away from the camp. No blood. Nothing. I'll never know what happened to them that night. But I didn't stick around to find out. I grabbed a canteen they'd left behind and sprinted through the trees until my legs gave out. I didn't stop running until I reached a small Allied outpost, where I collapsed in the snow. To this day, I have no idea what those soldiers were shooting at, but I'll never forget their faces, the way they were looking at something deep in the woods, something none of us could see. It wasn't the enemy they were afraid of that night. It was something else, something worse. If you want to hear more stories like this, please like and subscribe. Also, check out my other videos.